Friends, welcome to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. I married my husband Victor at the age of 19, and a few months after the wedding, I started cheating on him with Oleg Sergeyevich from work. It was an affair that lasted almost 3 years. I'm not sure why this happened, because it was a long time ago, and I'm certainly not going to try to justify it, except that at that age, the thrill of doing something that probably shouldn't have had anything to do with it. So I'll just write down how it happened the first time, and you can figure out who seduced whom. At that time, I worked in the office of the local Terra management company in St. Petersburg, mostly just answering the phone and filling out documents, a rather boring office job. There were 3 women in the company's office on weekdays, but on Saturday morning we took turns coming to work for half a day to take urgent calls and the like from residents. This usually meant that as soon as the emergency team went on a call, we were on our own. And I liked it, if only because that Saturday morning, out of 3 employees, I was responsible for all emergency calls from citizens, and I really had to make decisions on the departure of emergency workers' brigades. But on one of my Saturdays, the engineer on duty, Oleg Sergeyevich, came to me to check my work on accepting applications, and that's when everything started. It was the middle of summer, it was hot and stuffy, so I opened the windows and the door of a rather cramped office room to try to blow it with a little breeze, which meant that I could hear Oleg Sergeyevich rattling something in his office. I didn't mind. His presence somehow made the day less lonely in the empty office of the company, and I smiled to myself when I heard his cheerful but discordant whistle as he rummaged through his papers lying on his desk. Therefore, when I finished the registration for the next accident to the emergency team, it was enough to interrupt the time. I shouted to Oleg Sergeyevich to find out if he wanted me to make him coffee when I would cook for myself. Oleg Sergeyevich said that yes, make a cup for me. I made 2 cups and invited him to join me. There were no ulterior motives at the time, at least on my part, except that it's always nice to have someone to chat with during a coffee break. Oleg Sergeyevich came in and plopped down in an empty chair next to me, and we just sat and chatted, just inconsequential chatter about nothing in particular. Oleg Sergeyevich was older than me, somewhere in his 40s, but he was always the soul of the company, armed with a sly smile and a great sense of humor. He always managed to get people to like him, and I was no exception, although there's a damn big difference between loving someone and liking him. Anyway, I liked Oleg Sergeyevich, and I thought he just liked me without any other attachments. But it seems like maybe I was wrong. Just as we were finishing our coffee, the phone rang, and I turned my chair around to answer the call, rudely leaving Oleg Sergeyevich looking at my back. Communicating with a panicked client who discovered a leaking pipe brought Oleg Sergeyevich out of some thoughts, and therefore by the time I persuaded the client to turn off the water and calmed him down, promising to send an emergency plumber as soon as he appeared, I almost forgot about Oleg Sergeyevich's presence. But after I finished the call and started recording the request in the emergency call log, Oleg Sergeyevich gave me a very pleasant reminder that he was sitting next to me. Because of the hot weather, I was wearing a loose blouse with a low neckline, and my long hair was pinned up so that cool air could get on my neck. But the air wasn't the only thing that reached him. As I leaned over the table and wrote in a magazine, I felt the tips of my fingers suddenly and very gently begin to stroke the back of my head. I did not notice how Oleg Sergeyevich got up and silently stood right behind my back. I flinched in surprise and the stroking stopped, but the fingers were still on my neck, and then, when I stopped complaining, they began to gently caress my skin again. That was the moment when I should have stopped it, but I didn't. It wasn't because I was in awe of an older man or anything like that. I can be a stubborn bitch when I need to be. No, it was just because it felt so good, and the thought that it might lead to other things never crossed my mind, although stroking my neck is almost guaranteed to turn me on. Instead, I pretended not to notice anything, and finished filling out the log entry, which made it take much longer than necessary. Oh my God, it was nice. The delicate fingertips just glided over my skin, barely touching, but still causing a shiver of pleasure down my back, and we didn't say a word. I couldn't pretend that I was writing forever. I got to the point where I had nothing else to write down, and I just sat leaning forward. Should I have sat down and told Oleg Sergeyevich to stop? Of course I should, but I didn't do it. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, obediently tilted my head forward and passively put my hands on the armrests of the chair. Everything was a clear sign that he should continue, which Oleg Sergeyevich did. But perhaps Oleg Sergeyevich interpreted my passivity a little differently than I intended. I thought I meant that he just wanted to keep doing what he was doing, but he took it as permission to go a little further. Years later, I know how a man's mind works, but in my youthful innocence, I expected him to understand. Or maybe he understood my desires better than I did. For a while, Oleg Sergeyevich just continued stroking my neck with one hand, but then another hand joined them, and they began stroking, on both sides of my neck, down, under my ears, and moving to my throat. It felt so good that there was no way I could tell him to stop. Soon my breathing began to deepen, and I felt my insides turn to jelly. I was excited, very excited. But then, obviously, it was Oleg Sergeyevich's intention to gently excite me, and I should have foreseen this. Soon the tips of his fingers began to slowly work their way lower, stroking my ears and chin, but expanding their range to cover more and more of my front body. I knew what he was getting at, but even before his fingers found the first sign of my cleavage, I realized that I liked it. I just let Oleg Sergeyevich continue to do it. Oleg Sergeyevich was very careful, allowing his fingertips to caress the upper part of my chest, as if he wanted to be able to refuse me this if necessary. He was probing the ground, deciding whether I would object to his gentle caresses or not. He must have noticed that my breathing became heavier. Oleg Sergeyevich must have noticed that my eyes closed and my lips parted. But still he took his time, touching a little more of my skin each time, until he began to push my blouse even further away very slightly to gain access to my breasts. By then, I wouldn't have minded anymore. In fact, I was fast approaching the point where I wanted to grab his wrist and shove his hand into my bra, but I didn't have the courage. I just let Oleg Sergeyevich continue stroking my skin, focusing each hand on the upper curve of one of my breasts. Oleg Sergeyevich stood closer, slowly extending his hand down my front until his fingers suddenly found the edge of my bra, and only then did he stop. For once, I understood. After he put his fingers under my bra, there was no turning back. I didn't pretend that there was no hint in what he was doing. Up to this point, he could convince someone, including perhaps himself, that all this was innocent, but not afterwards. As for me, I have long passed the point of no return. I could have started innocently enough, but that innocence dried up as my love excitement grew. At that moment, I wasn't sure how far I was ready to let him go, but touching my breasts was definitely exciting for me. I reached out and silently unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my blouse, clearly allowing me to move on. He leaned over me so his fingers could explore more, sliding them down under my blouse and then inside my bra, not quite cupping my breasts yet, but very nearly. I could hear his excited breathing almost in my ear, and I knew that Oleg Sergeyevich was just as excited as I was. I undid another button, and then leaned forward to reach out and undo my bra. Oleg Sergeyevich removed his hands to allow me to bend over, but at the moment when I leaned back, both of his hands slid straight over my front. Now, without hesitation, without the slightest bit down, Oleg Sergeyevich just shoved them under my unbuttoned bra and grabbed my chest, holding and massaging it. Oleg Sergeyevich rolled my chest between his fingers, squeezing and tugging just enough to make it hurt. It was the first time anyone had done this to me, but it was good, damn good, and I just let him do it, hearing his little growling sounds matching my excited sighs as we both enjoyed what he was doing. I got more and more aroused until I had to force myself to remain passive. But then Oleg Sergeyevich leaned a little further and gently kissed the back of my head before sliding his lips along my side. The sensations were wonderful. Erotic goosebumps ran up and down my back as my hands gripped the arms of the chair. I tilted my head to the side to encourage him to do it again. He did so, this time letting his tongue do the same thing as his lips. His rapid breathing cooled the moisture and increased the sensation. This, in addition to what Oleg Sergeyevich was doing with my breasts, pushed me beyond the limits of meek compliance. I wanted to kiss him, needed to kiss him, feel how this tongue slides between my lips and explores my mouth. I wasn't ready for everything yet, but I think I was very close to it. I turned my swivel chair around, intending to get up and kiss Oleg Sergeyevich, without thinking about any consequences. I just wanted to hold him close so he could hug me, feel his body pressed against mine and his mouth against mine. But turning the chair, I raised my eyes level with the front of his trousers and immediately became acutely aware of the bulge, which Oleg Sergeyevich did not even try to hide. Almost instinctively, my hand reached out to touch him, to outline and stroke the erection of his penis lying under the fabric of his trousers. He seemed solid, big, and beautiful, and I found myself looking for his zipper, finding it and pulling it down. I looked up, perhaps asking his permission, and then, when Oleg Sergeyevich did not object, I put my fingers in his trousers, searching, finding and releasing his aroused penis. Now all thoughts of kissing him were forgotten. I just wanted to play with what I found in Oleg Sergeyevich's trousers. Oleg Sergeyevich's penis was large, larger than my husband's. I don't mean that he was very big, although he seemed so to me due to my inexperience, but his thick circumcised penis was certainly not something shameful for a man. I wrapped my fingers around him, running them up and down his entire length, feeling his warmth, hardness, and the corrugations of his veins. It felt and looked beautiful, and I just stared at him as I played, feeling his hands land on my shoulders to calm down. But then a beautiful little bead of liquid appeared on the tip of its head, a brightly shiny liquid. I looked at the penis for a minute or two, and then obeyed my impulse. I leaned forward and licked him with the tip of my tongue, just touching his penis tip to tip. It was delicious, very tasty, and I wanted more. I leaned forward again, but this time I opened my lips and took him in my mouth, licking and sucking him, looking for more of his fabulous juice. I loved him, his size, hardness, warmth, and smoothness of his cropped head. Before I realized what was happening, I was pleasuring him, my hand holding the base of his penis while my mouth covered as much as it could hold, sliding back and forth along his penis length. Now I was determined to please him by forcing Oleg Sergeyevich to finish the job in my mouth so that I could taste his delicious cream of liquid. Oleg Sergeyevich was clearly not going to object. He began to grab my shoulders, his hips moved vaguely back and forth, slightly pushing me, and very soon I heard him breathing heavily, his muscles tensing as the climax approached. I braced myself for his flow of semen. My tongue came back to close my throat, and my fingers squeezed a little tighter. But that never happened. Just when I was sure he was about to shoot, we both heard an emergency vehicle drive into the yard, and we guiltily dispersed, each desperately trying to clean up and calm down before the returning plumber entered the office. Oleg Sergeyevich hurriedly disappeared back into his office, desperately trying at the same time to shove his erection back into his trousers, leaving me with only the memory of him in my mouth. I could have cried. I was so hot and upset that I couldn't finish him off that I could barely gather my thoughts, let alone straighten my clothes. In fact, as soon as I buttoned the top button of my blouse, Sergey, the plumber, burst in, full of good mood and enthusiasm. I still felt excited and my heart was still racing when I took the documents from him about his last emergency call and gave him a new task to fix the water break in the apartment. How appropriate, I thought bitterly. I almost have my own leak that could be related to plugging. Sergey left as quickly as he came. His emergency car drove out of the yard even before I had time to write down his worksheet. That's it, a lightning visit that completely ruined my day. At least as far as I could tell, Sergey hadn't seen or suspected anything. Mechanically, I got up and filed an application in a work journal. My body ached from disappointed need. I wanted Oleg Sergeyevich to come back so that we could continue, knowing that Sergey would need the rest of the morning to complete the application, and therefore he would not return for at least an hour. But then I realized that Peter Ivanovich, another engineer that day, could come back at any time and interrupt us again. And anyway, part of me knew all too well that I was making love to a man who wasn't my husband, and that part wanted it not to happen at all, and certainly not to continue. But that part, my conscience, was far outweighed by the intense excitement I was still feeling. I was so confused inside that I didn't know what I wanted. It took quite a long time before Pyotr Ivanovich came in, a time during which I reflected on what had happened and how I felt about it. During all this time, Oleg Sergeyevich and I had not exchanged a single word, and therefore I had no idea about his motives. Was it a momentary thing that got out of control, or did he really want me? I had no idea about his thoughts and had no idea if he would want to continue. But by the time Pyotr Ivanovich came, I decided that I wanted Oleg Sergeyevich to want me, and that if he did, I would let him go as far as he wanted, and be damned consequences. I was too excited to do anything else. I made the last 2 calls of the day, and when Pyotr Ivanovich left, we were no longer bothered until we closed. I shuddered with excitement at what I expected to happen, and waited for Oleg Sergeyevich to come back and start arousing me again. But Oleg Sergeyevich did not do this, and I did not hear him in the office. I waited a little longer, and then, still feeling excited and anxious, I put the calls on the answering machine and went to Oleg Sergeyevich's office. Oleg Sergeyevich was still in his office, sitting at a small table in the corner, looking at some papers, and looked very guilty when I entered. Oleg Sergeyevich turned the chair around to face me. I know, he said softly. This shouldn't have happened. I'm sorry, Arochka. It wasn't exactly what I expected or wanted, so I stood and stared at him in mute surprise. If you promise not to say anything about it, I promise it will never happen again. I smiled to myself, realizing that he was afraid for his job, but making a fuss was the last thing on my mind. I tried to think of something to say. I am very sorry for Ira, Oleg Sergeyevich repeated. You look amazing and I got carried away. I am so sorry. No, I replied, finally finding my voice. I liked what you were doing. Oleg Sergeyevich looked at me in amazement. I'm glad. I could see the thoughts running through his head. But we must not let this happen again. I didn't want to hear that. And why not? Because... Oleg Sergeyevich hesitated. Because you're much younger than me and I don't want to take advantage of it. And anyway, you're married. Would you take advantage of me? I told Oleg Sergeyevich, making it clear that I was here for him to fuck me. That would be wrong. I wasn't in the mood to be turned down by a man who started something he wasn't ready for. His sudden nervous breakdown just made me more determined. I'm older now. I wouldn't think so. But I was 19 and I wasn't as mature as I'd like to think. There's nothing wrong with that. I objected to him. Because it would be nice for us to make love. Oleg Sergeyevich sat and just shook his head, but I saw how he hesitated. I walked over, stood in front of him, and started unbuttoning my blouse again. Just like I should have done before. That's when Oleg Sergeyevich should have said no. But he didn't. This time I didn't stop at just the top 2 or 3 buttons. I unbuttoned them all from top to bottom, and then pulled the blouse off the skirt and let it unfasten freely, showing the curves of my chest over a white quarter-cup bra. I stood with my blouse unbuttoned and looked at Oleg Sergeyevich. I can tell he was tempted, but he didn't move. You used to like them, Oleg Sergeyevich, I reminded him. Now I also like them, Oleg Sergeyevich confessed. But you have to keep it a secret. I shrugged, letting my blouse slide down my arms to shake out and land on the floor. Oleg Sergeyevich did not move, but his eyes betrayed his thoughts. I continued, deciding to pick up his penis again, and reached back to unbutton the bra, allowing him to follow the blouse to the floor. I was breathing heavily, partly from excitement, but now mostly from nerves. I've never done anything like this before, and here I am, naked to the waist in front of a man who is twice my age, and openly invite him to touch me. Oleg Sergeyevich still didn't move, but he couldn't take his eyes off my beautiful big breasts. I looked back at him with eyes shining with excitement, and then, when Oleg Sergeyevich was still doing nothing, I squeezed my chest and shook it, leaning forward to offer it to him. Now I could hear his breathing, as heavy as mine. We were both excited, and only his conscience and fear of the consequences held him back. I did not suffer from either. My conscience was subordinated to my motives, and at the age of 19 I did not even think about any possible consequences. Don't you want to touch them, Oleg Sergeyevich? I asked hoarsely. Of course, he agreed without moving from his place. Then touch them. I moved even closer. My knees pressed against his knees and my chest was a few centimeters away from his face. It was a now or never moment. Oleg Sergeyevich made a strange sound and put his hands on my shoulders, pushing me away. For a moment I thought I had blown him up, but then he stood up, grabbed me, hugged me and pulled me to him, his mouth finding mine in the same quick movement. The kiss was short and painful, strong enough to tilt his head back, but his lips barely parted. He pulled away as quickly as he had started and held me at arm's length, still struggling with his desires. Well, you're a fool and a fool, Oleg Sergeyevich said through his teeth. It's your fault, Oleg Sergeyevich. I told him the truth. You were the first to seduce me. We were standing in front of each other, both breathing heavily and both seemed to be thinking what to do next. I looked into his eyes. He wanted me, if only he would admit it, and I wanted him. After a minute or so, I reached out and took his hand, guiding it to my bare right breast, and then put my hand on his arm to hold it in place. Oleg Sergeyevich did not help, but he did not resist either. I squeezed his hand on me, moving it over my chest, massaging and manipulating it while he stood and passively let me. It was good, very good, but I wanted him to take responsibility. You do it, I told him, and then I raised my hand, hoping that he would do as I asked. Oleg Sergeyevich hesitated for what seemed like an eternity, just putting his motionless hand on me. Mentally, I held my breath, and then his fingers squeezed my flesh, and I smiled at him. He smiled back, smiling crookedly in agreement. You're a fool, Urka, Oleg Sergeyevich repeated, this time more gently. But you can fix it all, I whispered. Oleg Sergeyevich nodded, and then his free hand rose to grasp my other breast, and I involuntarily breathed a sigh of relief. He grinned and leaned forward to kiss me, grabbing my chest to pull me to him instead of hugging me. I moaned with pleasure, and this time I kissed him properly, my tongue finding a way between his lips to explore his mouth. It was his turn to moan when Oleg Sergeyevich responded to my kiss, his fingers rolling over my chest and turning it into small, hard bumps. This time, when the kiss was over, Oleg Sergeyevich sat back down and pulled me closer, so that I stood between his knees. My chest was unprotected in front of him. I put my hands on his shoulders and waited, quite sure of what he was going to do, and it was so good that I was right. One arm wrapped around me and he leaned forward to take the nipple in his mouth, and with his free hand covered my other breast. I sighed and moaned softly as he kissed one breast, squeezing and massaging the other, tugging at my nipple and rolling it between his fingers. I kept my hands on his shoulders to calm down and just tilted my head back, closing my eyes and curving my mouth into a satisfied smile. It was amazing, and all the better because it was illegal. I knew I had a husband, but at that moment, to be honest, I didn't care. When his mouth was on my chest and his teeth were nibbling on my nipple, I almost didn't notice his hand moving until I felt it work its way down my stomach, heading down. I mumbled something inaudible in agreement and let him continue, feeling his fingers slide over the fabric of my skirt until they reached the hem, and then stopped. Oleg Sergeyevich gathered his courage and then, without asking my permission, put his hand under it on my thigh and pushed it up. His fingers caressed my skin. I moaned softly deep in my throat and spread my knees as far as he would allow, knowing where Oleg Sergeyevich would touch me next time. Hesitation on his part was now a thing of the past, and his hand slid up my leg, stopping only briefly at the edge of my panties before burrowing under them, pushing the panties aside. You're a wet bitch, he noticed when the tip of his finger found my slippery entrance. I know. I smiled. I was going to add something about who was to blame for this, but before I could add anything, Oleg Sergeyevich stuck his finger right into me. I heard myself gasp in shock, although, to tell the truth, there was no surprise. Another finger followed the first, and he began to enter and exit in a slow, deep rhythm that was guaranteed to succeed. I just let him do it, and soon I felt its effect. Oleg Sergeyevich, you will make me come, I warned him with bated breath. I intend to. Oleg Sergeyevich grinned. What can I do? What can I want to do other than enjoy it? I felt the sensations build up like water behind a dam, until very soon I was detained on the verge of explosion, almost there, very close, but for some reason not quite. The pressure built up further, intensifying the strongest feeling I've ever experienced, until Oleg Sergeyevich plunged his fingers as hard and deep into me as he could, while sharply biting my nipple, and finally I tipped over the edge, gasping and twitching in this state, tightly squeezing his shoulders until he eventually disappeared. Then I just stood on jelly legs, breathing heavily, hanging my head and opening my mouth, and waited for my breath to return. Oleg Sergeyevich let his fingers slip out of me and held them between us, turning them for inspection. You're devastated, girl, he told me, looking at his slimy fingers. I nodded and smiled weakly, unable to speak. Oleg Sergeyevich looked at his fingers for another minute or two, and then brought them to my lips. His desire was obvious. I opened my mouth and let him gently push them between my lips, and then licked my own juices off them, enjoying this business more than he realized. I've tried myself before, many times, but I've never tried it from someone's fingers, and the novelty was wonderful. Take off your skirt, Ira, Oleg Sergeyevich suddenly ordered me. And panties, too. I did as I was told. Completely naked, I stood in front of him, guessing what was waiting for me. Lean over this table, Irochka. It was his old desk, and it was far from spotless and clean. But I didn't care. I wanted what he wanted. I bent down, my stomach and chest pressed against its battered surface, my cheek rested against it, and my hands clung to the far edge, just waiting for Oleg Sergeyevich to take me. I didn't have to wait long. I could already hear the rattle of his belt buckle as he unbuttoned his trousers. Oleg Sergeyevich groped my hole with his finger, pushing it into me as a guide for his organ. It was a little strange, but I took a deep breath of happiness, knowing that I would get what I needed now. His organ found its target, pushing inside when his finger was removed and his hands found my hips, gripping me tightly, as if to make sure I couldn't break free. I felt Oleg Sergeyevich get a little closer, and then with a distinct grunt he leaned forward, plunging his big organ into me to the full depth. His stomach slammed into my back. I couldn't help but compare his organ with that of my husband, whose slower and more attentive penetration aroused me only half as much as Oleg Sergeyevich's confident love. Once inside me, Oleg Sergeyevich's organ set a brutal rhythm, pulling me back onto his organ as he slammed into me so that my body was pushed and pulled back and forth across the rough surface of his ancient table. I remember gasping loudly in pain several times when my hips hit the edge of the table, but I didn't mind. It was worth it. Oleg Sergeyevich used me without caring about it, apparently intending only for his own satisfaction, his own liberation. But by doing this, he brought me to the most powerful explosion that I had ever experienced before, and which surpassed only those that Oleg Sergeyevich gave me in other, later, our love affairs. We brought the matter to an end practically together, although it seems that I brought the matter to an end a few seconds before Oleg Sergeyevich. It didn't matter, he was in charge, and he would keep me at this table for as long as it took. All I know is that my climax pretty much exploded inside me, and then he crashed into her, his liquid gushing into me, accompanied by his heavy moans and painfully tight grip on both my thighs. Now I was strongly pressed against the edge of the table when Oleg Sergeyevich leaned towards me. His organ twitched and twitched with each jet of his liquid poured into me, and it seemed that this could go on forever. Of course not. Eventually, Oleg Sergeyevich's organ broke free and he leaned back in his chair, leaving me naked, gasping and panting, lying over his desk. I turned my head and looked at Oleg Sergeyevich. His trousers and underpants were half to his knees. His organ was twitching, still wet from my juices and his liquid. Oleg Sergeyevich looked at me and grinned. "You little fool, Urka." "You can say whatever you want about me, Oleg Sergeyevich," I replied, taking a quick breath between each word. I pushed away from the table and looked around for my clothes, bending down to pick them up from the floor. "I wanted to please you," I said to Oleg Sergeyevich, watching him remove his organ from sight before getting up to straighten his clothes. "Next time," Oleg Sergeyevich said, not looking at me at all. At least it confirmed what would happen next time. My heart jumped with unexpected delight. "But we should meet somewhere more private, and then we can do whatever we want, Irochka." That night, when my husband and I went to bed and he made love to me, I experienced a secret thrill from the realization that another man's organ was already in me today, having taken 2 organs into myself in one day. I think that's what did it for me, this illicit love with another man, and that's why I made sure it happened many more times. My affair with Oleg Sergeyevich lasted almost 3 years, and in the following years there were other men. I suspect that my husband realized this over time, at least partially, but he never said anything, and neither did I, that I was dating other men.